right, shall we get started? Anyone want to wait 10 more minutes just for the heck of it? No, I don't either, because the longer I talk, the more I can say. All right, so let's get started. Hi everyone, my name is Nitya Narasimhan, and today my goal is to basically talk to you about what it means to go from being somebody who just kind of like focuses on how you enable user interactions on your app to basically getting a better understanding of what your user is doing and supporting those. So my focus is going to be on data-driven development and specifically looking at Firebase Analytics. Very high-level picture. If I do my job right, at the end of this talk, you should be able to answer 3 questions. First, what are analytics, right? So one of the things that I've seen is that, we all hear this term, we've all kind of like encountered it, but may not really know what that means to you as an application developer. Second, why use Firebase? There are so many solutions out there. Why Firebase? And third, how do I get started? So a little bit about me. I took a lot of time to make this pink, so appreciate it now. But my background is actually in research. The worst thing is those little bubbles tell you how many years I've been doing software. Don't count it up, you'll know how old I am. But the thing about me is I started in research in California. And I worked on distributed systems at the time. And basically that kind of gave me a lasting love for doing things that are about innovative, early, advanced concepts. But then I moved to Chicago, actually, and worked at Motorola for 12 years in their applications and platforms group. And that's where I first came across the term analytics. Because for those of you who are not aware, Motorola used to work in both set-top boxes and mobile. So what we were looking at was, how do you know where the user's attention is when he's watching TV? Is he watching the TV or is he doing something on his phone? And based on that, how can you monetize it, right? So we were looking at it from that perspective, and that was fun. But it wasn't until a few years ago when I moved to New York, and actually to the Hudson Valley, and I started working as an independent developer with mostly local and small startups, that I realized that analytics actually has a way more critical purpose through the entire app lifecycle. So let's get started by asking what exactly are analytics, right? Here's a trend that kind of gives us a reason why we need to look at it. If you look at the App Store, the Play Store, as of March, there were 2.8 million apps. The trend there shows that applications are actually increasingly popular. Everybody wants one, right? You keep seeing applications come out, developers keep making them, people keep using them, right? But what does that actually mean to someone like me? I build apps for small businesses. What does that mean? It turns out it's not a one-size-fits-all problem. So I hope you can see some of this, but I kind of see 2 kinds of people in this equation. The first is a small business owner. Say someone who owns a salon near me, right? And they're like, hey, I heard apps are the cool thing. I want you to build an app for me. Okay, but when they think about an app, they're thinking about an app as something that's peripheral to their business. The real money for them is in that business, right? They're thinking of an app as a way to extend their business value. Whereas the other side is an indie game developer, right? They're like, hey, I have an idea for a new fun game I want to build. When they think about an app, that app is the business, right? It's not adding value to something else, it is the business. What does that mean? That means that their goals are different. The goal for the first person, if you ask her, hey, what's the one thing you want your app to do for you? They'll be like, I want that app to bring more people in through the door of my salon. That's what I want, right? If you ask the other person, they'll be like, my app is what makes money for me. I want more people to buy stuff in my game. In-app purchases is what's important. So their goals are really different, right? But it turns out their challenges are really, really similar. So these are all like famous buzzwords, so I kind of wanted to simplify them in a way that I can understand and keep track of. First, how many of you have heard this term acquisition and retention? Yes, good, there's some of you. I actually think of it very simply as, does your app have users? You built this app, did anybody know it existed? Did they find it? Did they download and install it? And are they using it? Second, does my app meet user expectations? That's really about engagement and understanding. Are the users of my app doing what I wanted them to do? Or are the users of my app actually finding satisfaction in the app experience I've provided? And then, of course, the third thing is both of the top 2, they're great, they're wonderful. But making all that happen, has costs. So the most important thing for me at the end of the day is this app actually driving revenue in some meaningful way? How am I monetizing it? So it turns out that this is where analytics helps. Analytics can bring actionable insights. Very high level, two kinds. Quantitative is where you're really gathering data that tells you what the user is doing, when they're doing it, how they're doing it. This is actually a lot of the focus of what we'll look at today, because these are easy for you to instrument and get simply through software, right? Because they're very objective things. The qualitative side, though, is why did he do it? I know what he did, but why, right? That's subjective. That's qualitative. That's when you actually want to talk to the user. And it often turns out that you want to have this be a synergistic thing, right? You find something, you want to know why, or you know why, now you want to put in the information to make sure that you're actually getting the kinds of results you expect. Why is this important? Let's go back to those three questions. Anyone recognize this picture? Field of Dreams. Field of Dreams said, build it and they will come. How many of you do that to your apps? You just build it, throw it in the Play Store, and you walk away. You're all millionaires now, right? No. The bottom line is that's just a myth. In reality, you got to work hard to make sure people find it, and that's where marketing analytics helps. We as developers often think, marketers, but no. That's what actually brings in the people who are going to use your app. Let's look at another picture. Second question. Does my app meet user expectations? One of my favorite pictures of all time. This is something called desire paths. Desire paths is the difference between what you designed for and what the user actually does. Think of it as this is the design path, that's the desire path, right? And it's important because this is something you want to find out about, because when you actually do your app, you design so that all your monetization things are on this path. If he walks away there, he ain't seeing them, he ain't using them, you got nothing. So here, behavior analytics serves two purposes. It tells you how well did you design? How many people are walking this path? And it tells you how badly did you understand your user? Where does he actually go? And finally, the third question, does my app drive revenue? So both the things that we talked about before, you can instrument things, you find it out, you build them, but if you can't convert it into something useful, it's useless. So the important thing to take away from here is, of all the things that happen in my app, what are the most critical actions that the user does? And those are the ones I want to A, identify, and B, build on. So if you take one slide away from this, hopefully at the end of this talk, this will be your mindset. So when we kind of do development work, at least like as an independent developer, you kind of are always focused on the left side, right? You talk to your customer and you say, okay, let me plan it and I'll design it. So the planning says, identify what your key goals are. You tell me what are the important things you want in your app, and I'm going to then design my user experience so that they support your goals. If at that time I walk away, you'll have the desire paths problem. So what we want to do with analytics is really the second part, which is measure and adapt. Measure means you defined a goal, you created a user experience to support the goal, you really want to evaluate how well your design actually achieved that goal, and the adapt part says, when it didn't, take actions to correct it, and when it did, take actions to amplify it. That's pretty much it. So, measure. What does measure mean? At some point in your life, if you kind of go into analytics, you're going to see all of these, and we'll see it also in a dashboard later. So just want to make you aware of some of the terminology. On the left side, you'll see 5 things in white. If you look at the first initials, they spell out AARRR, which is R, so pirate metrics, which I kind of discovered very recently. I thought were very cool. But really, what they focus on is the onboarding experience. I want to track what things did my marketer, what campaigns, how did I get people, how did they find me, acquisition. Activation, once they found me, did they actually download and install my app? Retention, they installed my app, did they come back? Referral, they installed my app and played with it, did they actually like it enough to go tell some of their friends about it so I actually grow my audience? And finally, revenue, in what ways were they making money? So I kind of want to bring out just 2 stats that might be interesting in this context. When we talk about retention, how many of you know that statistics show that in the first month, you will lose 90% of your daily active users? 90%, which means that you're really trying to either keep those people, like reduce that amount or really monetize the 10% that are remaining. So that's one statistic. Now let's look at the other side. Here, when we talked about all those pirate metrics, it was marketing related. The general metrics are really developer driven, right? The usage, engagement. What did the user do? That's really about desired paths. What is he doing? How often does he do it? Let me understand if I should maybe monetize more of these paths for user A and more of those paths for user B. Notifications. That app is always not going to be in the foreground of the user's phone. How do I bring him back? Notifications will make him do that. Great, I sent him notifications. Did he do something or did he get annoyed and uninstall me? Good to know. It happens. Crash analytics. Nothing turns a user off as much as failures, right? So when something crashes, can I detect it and fix it before he decides this is not worth my time? So one of the things I want to point out is this metric in here which says a user spends 75% of his time in his top 3 apps. That means you or my small business owner, when they build an app, are battling with those 3 apps to get the user's attention. So it's really, really important to understand in the user's timeline when we can get his attention to do the things we want him to do. So bottom line is, this is what we want to focus on in analytics. Measure and accept. In what way can we measure the data in our app so we understand our user behaviors? Once we understand them, how can we take actions seamlessly so we can actually reinforce good behaviors or correct the bad behaviors? The good thing, lots of good tools out there. So I use Firebase. Appreciate the emojis. It took me a long time to find them. I don't have good emoji game at all. So the statistic for Firebase, this is something they throw around a lot, but it's important to know. Users interact with their phones 150 times a day. In the case of conferences, they interact with it 150 times per session. That's good too. That's a lot of data. So you've got a ton of data that now someone has to capture, analyze, and run actions on. This is not a spreadsheet problem. This is a big data problem, right? So yeah, there are lots of tools. So what's the problem? Problem is that if you look at the measure side, so you want to gather data about all the things the user is doing, yeah, there are a lot of people out there who are going to give you services. Each one of them has their own data format. They kind of say, hey, I'm going to capture it in this way, I'm going to capture it in this way, but I'll give you the insights you need, which is great until you want to correlate across them. Then you become a data mule. When you are an independent developer with a small business, that's a cost, that's an effort that you may not have time for. The second side is adapt, right? Sure, lots of service providers to help you do notifications, to do crash analytics, etc. Similar issue. Now, you're a developer. You need to know how to integrate with all those services. You need to map to their APIs, and you need to do it with your small budget and time. Automating actions gets harder. So this is kind of like, asking the question, what if there was some place where you could have one data format for all of the data that you need to collect? You have one place where all the kind of follow-on services were seamlessly integrated. Is that possible? And we know what the title of the talk is, so yeah. Kind of led you to this, but that's Firebase. So that's at least the way I looked at it, and that's the way I drank a lot of the Kool-Aid, I'll absolutely tell you. But I do think it has value. And at a very high level, the 3 I's that kind of like fall into the Firebase meets analytics is instrumentation, insight, and integration. Firebase provides you an SDK that lets you instrument your apps to gather the data. It provides you a dashboard so you automatically, without being a data scientist, have something that immediately gives you insights into the data you collected. And third, it has built-in services that allow you to integrate follow-up actions. So it's true that if I do not put this one picture up, I'm not doing a Firebase talk. If you go to any event and they don't have this, they won't do Firebase. So this is kind of like the Firebase platform picture, right? And I do apologize if you can't see it, but there are links in here. I'll make the slides available later. At a very high level, this reflects the 2 things that are good about Firebase. One, that it's not looking at it from a single perspective, it's looking at it from the entire life cycle. So you have services that help you develop your app, grow it, and monetize it. And the lifeblood of all of that in the middle is analytics. So if you kind of think of this whole thing as a giant organism with lots of organs each doing a certain thing in your app, analytics is your central nervous system, right? All it's doing is it's gathering all the data and relaying it across the entire body, finding out and triggering interesting events. What people do with it, how they actuate on it is their issue. We'll look at some of these a little bit later in terms of what the follow-on services are, but that's pretty much it. Instrumentation, single point, single data format, integration. Easy, single SDK to keep doing follow-up things. Insights. So in addition to the two of them, and we'll, at the end, we'll do a demo with an actual dashboard, so we can kind of like drill down and look at a few more things. Insights. If you are someone who's working with, a small project, you don't have the time or patience to go building your own custom insights. This one comes for you for free. And what it allows you to do is drill down, first get a kind of like a high-level perspective of all the data you gathered, what does it actually translate into in terms of the metrics we talked about, but then it allows you to drill down in terms of what are the specific events, what are the specific user value, etc. And we can look at that when we look at the demo. But this is the question that will always come at this point. All right, so I kind of see what you're saying, but I already do Google Analytics. Why Firebase? So again, I'm going to put my small business hat on and say it's free and unlimited. People like me, that's really, really important. Google Analytics has a paid tier once you scale. Now, obviously, you may not scale enough to like hit that tier, but the words free will get you every time. It is unlimited, which is really, really useful because you can play with a lot of ideas and you want to gather data. Second, I cannot emphasize this enough, it's mobile first. What that means is that if you look at like web analytics, you're kind of looking at it at the level of a session. Here you're looking at the level of a user. You actually are able to say, how did this particular user interact with my application experience? Third, going still on the granularity of it, fine-grained analytics at an event level, not at a page level. That means I can pretty much say on a specific thing, what did the user do, rather than somewhere on this page he did this. And finally, for someone like me who has to start with web and move to mobile, or start with mobile and move to web, it's cross-platform ready. So I can start with any one of my apps, build out a back end, and hopefully kind of like attach the other things later. We already talked about frictionless. The last thing, there's no such thing as Google IQ, so don't kind of say, oh my God, new product, no. This is just my terminology for what I mean by the fact that when you have a company like Google that's behind Firebase, they have a lot of intrinsic expertise and subject matter expertise in the area of analytics and advertising. Some of that stuff kind of gets given to you for free through this platform. So a couple of the examples are, at the end of the day, analytics is about gathering events. They can actually suggest good events that you should gather based on the kind of app you are. It's about knowing something about your user. They actually can provide you demographic information about that user without you having to instrument it, because they kind of glean it from their own observations about that user, right? So we kind of got through the part which is like, what are analytics and why Firebase? Hopefully, some small percent of you have drunk the Kool-Aid with me. But now, let's talk about how you get started. It's a super hard API. Not really. There's literally the one object called Firebase Analytics that you're going to interact with. And if you really just need to know at a high level what the kind of three big concepts in this are, it's user properties, events, and parameters. So Firebase Analytics is a singleton. You basically get an instance of it and attach it to the context of the activity that you're using. And so for every new UI view, every new activity in your Android app, you can attach a new Firebase Analytics object to track events from that. And once you've instantiated it, you can actually call methods on it to do a number of things. Before we get to that, let's talk about the other concepts. The first concept is user property. So what user property is analogous to a user profile preference, for instance, right? So if you think of an attribute that you think, oh, this could be something that might actually fit on a user profile, that's probably a user property. In concrete terms, it means that it's something that is true across a swath of events. Something like the user's age. Something like the fact that this user is left-handed. Something like the fact that, for example, in the salon, this user always gets the same haircut every time. Scout's honor. These are all things that are kind of like ways for you to like also later on group those users into categories based on a commonality of attribute. Second, event. Now this is actually the most important concept in analytics because it's defining what that data you capture is. So in Firebase Analytics, an event is a really, really simple piece of data. It has just two things. It has an event type and it has a bundle of parameters. So you can think of the type as kind of like the category of event or the class of event that's being generated in a particular context. And when you say that, the parameters become the context. So as a really kind of trivial way, think of parameters as metadata and the event type as kind of the class of event. So how do you use it? this is actually really simple. So the main object, you get an instance of it provide the context, whether if you're an activity, on create, you give your activity context. If you're doing some other application, you could do it there. Once you get a handle to the object, then, and I'm going to stop for a second to talk about this method called setAnalyticsCollectionEnable. It's not something that comes across very often, but it's interesting for a reason. When you actually integrate Firebase Analytics into your Android app, even if you did nothing, you just integrated it and walked away and didn't use the API, didn't do anything, it's collecting analytics for you off the block, right? Just without you doing anything at all, it collects a basic amount of information. Suppose you don't want that log for whatever reason, right? Privacy, could be anything else. You can't turn analytics collection off. By default, it's on and collects that. So now we're going to come to the two main methods, and then there's one interesting additional one that we'll talk about. Log event, very simple. You've got the object, log event, string type, bundle parameters, done. Set user property. User property is a name, value, set it, done, right? Not rocket science. Let's talk about set user ID, because this is something that you don't come across much when you're like looking at the documentation. So remember I told you Firebase is like cross-platform. When we talk about user level collection in a Firebase instance, what they say when they say user is really this app on this device. That's a unique user to them. But what if you're like me, you've got a phone and an iPad and you've got a Chromebook and you've got all of these things, it's still the same you across all of them. How do I correlate across these, right? To do that, you can do something called set user ID, where you provide some kind of indication that the user ID is the same one. That's the good news. The bad news is I'm not sure if you'll be able to actually see this later in the default dashboard, but we'll get there. Now that we kind of understand how to use the API, that's pretty much it. So at this point, you're like, wait, this is it? We're spending 40 minutes talking about an API that has 3 methods? Well, no, there's actually lots of interesting stuff to dig into once you know that. The user property. User property that we're setting, it's an attribute name value pair. You can have up to 25 unique user properties per app. That's a lot of information. However, I do believe that you can update it, but if you use the user property to like do things like set audiences, it may not be easy for you to retract them, so choose them with care. One of the main reasons why you need a user property in kind of like the default usage is that user properties allow you to filter down and view all that data through different facets. So you can kind of say, hey, user property, one of them is age. Show me all the events that reflect what a user in the age range 25 to 35 did on my app. That's not really the range, but right, you get the picture. In this particular case, when I talked about like the Google IQ thing, some user properties are auto-generated for you. So gender, interests, and age. And from the interests and the age part, and in fact gender, all 3 of them, they may not necessarily be 100% accurate. Meaning that if you were to actually put in your app a little profile thing that says, tell me your age and gender, and then look at it and compare it, it may not correlate 100%. That's because the Google IQ thing is actually looking at aggregate patterns and guessing. But sometimes those guesses are valid. From the event perspective, when you generate events, when you log events, that kind of like will then be used to like come up with insights. You can have up to 500 unique events per app. An event has an event type and attached parameters, we know that. But if you actually go to the dashboard and look at those events, you'll see that there'll be one interesting thing that happens. Once you've kind of declared and used an event, there's a little toggle that you can do to say, hey, this is a conversion event. What does that mean? We talked about it earlier, that a conversion event is actually something that is a really high value event that somehow is telling me these are important, they generate revenue for me in some way, for instance, right? So conversion events have one unique property, which is worth noting, which is that when you post events from your client side to the Firebase Analytics backend, they're not real time. So like all the analytics data is actually being batched up and sent. And it's not like it goes the day after, it's going to get there within a certain period of time, but it's not instantaneous real time, except for conversion events. When you mark something as a conversion event, it just says this is super important. When this happens, update it and push it out right away. Now, don't go crazy and mark every event in your dashboard a conversion event. I know some of you will think, oh, that's easy. No, don't do it, because that really undermines your value. But it has two additional side effects that I want to mention, which kind of like I just saw when I was crawling around. One is that it really, the minute you flip this conversion event bit, it automatically adds that into this tab called attribution. And what that does is it tells you, hey, who was responsible for these events? So if you're looking at the acquisition side, hey, how did people find my app? There are standard events that are already generated for that. You can say which of these campaigns, I shared this with my friend, I posted it on Facebook, I paid for a Google ad, I paid for this company. All of them, would have their own little identifiers. Which of these was the most important? The conversion events will let me look at the attribution. Where did that come from? And second, how many of you have heard of cloud functions? Yay. Okay, how many of you have heard of like the whole idea of serverless computing? Okay, so if you've used, okay, I should have asked this. How many of you have used Firebase? Okay, so if you've used Firebase, you know that there is really no server for you, right? So Cloud Functions lets you have server-side capability by associating little functions that can be run automatically based on events. Conversion events are the only analytics event that you can trigger Cloud Functions on. So if you want to be able to do things in real time based on an event, you can also think about making that a conversion event. So event types. We talked about the fact that an event is nothing but a type and a bundle of parameters. At a very high level in Firebase, you want to kind of look at it as three classes of events. The first is this automatic. So this is if you've done nothing, all of these get sent for you for free. And they kind of reflect the major parts of the marketing analytics that we talked about. First, they first open tells you when the user first opened the app, so that would be kind of your activation event. In-app purchases, every time the user did something that converted to revenue, whether it's buying something in assets, or I think there's also an e-commerce purchase as a separate event. User engagement, anytime he touches your app, there's a user engagement event, session start, OS update, and then I kind of like group them in three different classes. App update, remove all those tell you the life cycle. If you want to know what was the last thing that happened on the app before he removed it, good chance that was the last straw that broke the camel's back. So I kind of knowing that event helps, so you have those. Notifications automatically track for you. If you use notifications in your app, did the user see it? What did he do when he see it? Did he close it? Did he follow through on it, etc.? And then there's dynamic links. So dynamic links actually let you kind of leverage the fact that you can have a URL that automatically translates into something within your app. So you want to say, okay, if I send someone a dynamic link, how did they actually work on it? So the automatic ones are captured for you for free. Suggested ones are not captured for you for free. But what they actually do is for people like me who may not necessarily A, have the time to come up with new event types for everything, or B, may not have the domain expertise to know what the most relevant things are, they provide suggestions. But there's a kind of side value to it. So remember my use case of two different people. I have a gamer and I have a retail person, like who wants to run a store. Good for me. I don't have to think about, hey, I can immediately go and say, there are certain things that I'm going to capture in your app that are relevant to the domain of expertise that you have, and here you go. But it's not just about the fact that they give you these. There is a kind of a secondary effect that we're going to talk about in just a second. And before we do that, we're going to talk about the third concept, which is parameters. Parameters are just the context that you associate with an event. You're going to put up to 25 parameters per event type. Custom parameters is where you come up with your own metadata, your own parameter types. But when you use a suggested event that you just saw in the previous slide, they come with their own parameter types. And when you use those, you get some extra freebies. Those come in the form of enhanced dashboards. So when you use your own parameter types, they really don't know what you're talking about, so they can't really reason on it to do anything new in visualization for you. But if you use a recommended type, they know what those parameters mean. So when you use them, you immediately get this other thing. So for example, this is a gaming thing. So it says level up is a recommended event, and it has two parameters, level and character. So if you use those events in your app, those parameters are passed on. You automatically get this additional tiny dashboard here that shows here are all the level up, how many of those events were at different levels, right? So you get that for free, which is good. So more visibility, and this is maybe my one small nitpick with Firebase Analytics is that when you've got all this data, it spoils you because the dashboard gives you a bunch of rich stuff, but then you want to find out something specific. There is no way for you to drill down into it. You get what you get, and you can't do more. unless there are ways around it, you can actually move it to BigQuery and do more stuff there. But this was my kind of like, oh, okay, there's a little bit of an end run. If I use some of these custom parameter types, I can actually look at it. So that kind of like covers, here's Firebase, here's what it does. So let's talk about now the nitty-gritty of how you integrate it. It's super hard. Actually, it isn't. First step is, this is the hardest part. You need to have a Gmail account. How many of you do not have a Gmail account? Wow. Tough crowd. Okay. So all you need is a Gmail account. You log in. There's a free tier. Go create a project. Come up with a unique name for your project. Done. The minute you finish this step, you get yourself a Firebase backend set up. It's automatically set up to work with all your apps, right? So you can have web, iOS, Android. Great. Now the next part must be super hard, right? So how many of you upgraded your Android Studio to Beyond 2.2? Okay, let me put it this way. How many of you have not? How many of you are still running an Android Studio version 2. and lower? Okay, this one is for you. If you're sitting with the old one, you're going to work for it because you have to go through this wizard and it tells you, and it's not really difficult, but it's still 3 manual steps, right? That's 3 more steps than someone like me wants to do, but still I did them. And what you end up doing is you end up getting 2 things. You go through the wizard on the back end, you get yourself a configuration file that has all the information for the Firebase backend, you go into your client-side Android Studio, you set up your Gradle dependencies, you bring the file in and import it so that it knows what your Firebase configuration is, and it's done. And I thought, wow, okay, it's not too bad, but I like this. So if you're in 2.2 and more, they have buttons. So you basically go Tools Firebase. The minute you go to that, it gives you a little thing which says Connect to Firebase, Log Analytics. So Connect to Firebase basically will authenticate you and ask you which of your Firebase projects do you want to use. You pick the one you want to use. At that point, all you've done is told it what your Firebase backend is. You haven't told it what services you want to activate. Click your Add Analytics. That will actually activate your analytics. At that point, your app, if you did nothing else. If you walked away after this, your app is collecting the basic events. Okay? We'll talk about how to log stuff later. So at this point, if you've kind of like got to this part, you can then go verify setup. So if you're using the latest Android Studio, you would just go to your logcat, flip and pick the Firebase filter from your applications, and you can then start seeing logs for what your analytics library is actually doing for you. So some of the things you want to look for. First, you can actually see when you set a user property. Nothing major to look at, it just tells you the name and value. It's important to note this because user properties actually are across events. So when you set a user property, that remains valid for all the events that get batched afterwards. So when it actually finally sends them out, it'll put them together. There's an event that shows you what a log looks like when you log an event. And then this is actually the most important one. I don't know if you guys can actually see this, but if you try it out on your own, it's fairly easy to see. It tells you when the upload is scheduled. So in this case, for instance, you'll see it says scheduled upload in approximately 500 milliseconds. So you also get a sense of, when are these events going to show up on my dashboard? So when the upload actually happens, the log gives you a lot more information on exactly what went into the batched upload. So you'll see there'll be a bunch of user properties that kind of are valid for the entire bundle, and then a whole sequence of events that are being sent. So uploads are not necessarily in real time, but try setting something a conversion event and do that, and you'll see it happens immediately. There'll be no wait. So when you start this off, the sad part of it is that you'll see this kind of empty dashboard. You'll do all of this, and you'll be like, I can see my logs are sending events. I go to my dashboard and nothing's there because you got to wait 24 hours. It's usually a little bit less, but within 24 hours, this will start populating. So at this point, you have 2 choices. If you kind of really want to see what the analytics are, choice 1 is that there's actually a demo project that they've made available, which I hugely recommend you look at. And the demo project is data from a real-world app called Flooded that exists on both Android and iOS markets. And it has extensive data that you can trawl at your heart's content. So you really want to understand, even to kind of like, I would say, even before you start instrumenting your app, you want to understand how are people actually kind of coming up with event types and how frequently do they kind of put them in your app, etc. Really worth trawling that app, the demo app. So the second thing in this is when you look at the dashboard and you go to that, you want to kind of just see a couple of things. First is the first tab in there, and we'll do a demo at the end in about 5 minutes. The dashboard will give you high-level insights for your app, and then the events tab will let you drill down per event. So this is your option 1. Option 2, which I found out just last week, or at least I kind of started playing with it last week, you should know because I talked at DroidCon Boston, this is a completely different presentation from what I did there, was that there is a debug view. And debug view is not something you want to send into production, but it's a really, really useful view if you're going to be a developer. Use some ADV commands to turn on debug view for your app, and then you get to see real-time uploads. So whenever your app, like in debug view, your analytics doesn't batch, it sends. And that means that you can go into the dashboard and actually see events as they come in and validate that all the places you instrumented are actually doing what they're supposed to do. So a couple of things. You actually have aggregate level information on 3 kinds of events: general events, conversion events, and errors. But you can also see, you can kind of see for the last, I think, 30 seconds, like what the aggregate values are. But then on a second-by-second basis, it rolls up and shows you user properties being set, what kinds of events are being run. Logging is very simple. We won't go into this because I really want to go play with the dashboard a little bit. But get the instance, create a bundle. In this case, the parameters that we're using a standard event, a recommended event type, so we just know all the parameters. Log an event, give it a type and the bundle of parameters, log it, and you're done. Set user properties the same way. So let's actually now go play with the dashboard. I'm going to put this down. Hopefully that doesn't cause a mistake. So I'm actually going to put someone on the spot in a second, but here's the things we're going to explore with the demo app. So a nice way to understand what your analytics is getting you is to go look at the data. So we're going to go look at the flooded app that is provided for us as part of the Firebase backend. And what we're looking at is the dashboard app, the events, user properties, audiences, funnels, and cohorts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the last 3 when we kind of go through the demo, so to give you a sense of how they work. But I'll also say something really quickly. There are a lot of other things you should explore. I'm going to put Doug on the spot. He's sitting way out there in the Firebase shirt, and he has a session today. Is that today, Doug? Oh yeah, it's next. Okay, so when you're done with this, if you want to kind of know a little bit about what some of the cool new things in Firebase are, please go over to his session and listen to him. But we won't have time to explore this in the dashboard, but I'm going to just take a minute to talk about why these are relevant to our analytics play. So right now we kind of focused on the measure part, right? How do I instrument my app to get all the data? Now it's in analytics. Now we're going to look at insights to see how we actually kind of crawl them and find out what's happening. The integration part is something we haven't focused on. A number of really, really relevant integrations, and I'm going to take a couple of minutes to just mention what they are. Notifications allows you to schedule notifications based on things like, hey, I want on this event for this user audience, I want them to be given this notification on something, right? So let's say if you looked at me as a gamer, you will see I have a very strange behavior. If I'm playing Monument Valley between 9 and 5, you will find that I actually don't do much. It's very interstitial. But if it's between 5 and 8 on days that I have my meetup, you will find there's aggressive play going on. That's because between 9 and 5, that's me. Between 5 and 8, that's my 8-year-old. My 8-year-old buys stuff. I don't. Once you understand that behavior, that's an audience thing, right? You might recognize it, and then you might be able to target notifications in a way where you get me to buy stuff through that 8-year-old, right? So you might say, hey, this person for this event, when they're in this level and they've hit it, they're more likely to buy in-app purchases at this time of the day for this particular status, right? So when they move from level A to level B, if you tell them, hey, there's a new level, they will buy it. If they're not in that level like me, they're not going to do anything. So you could do that. Remote config. Remote config is basically a way for you to kind of give differentiated experiences to segments of your audience or of your user base based on using some of the insights from analytics. A very, very good example is A/B testing, right? So if you want to actually say, hey, I want to give one set of users one experience and another set another, in your code, you can come up with configuration parameters whose values are actually, you give them a default in the app, but whose values can then be changed on the back end based on certain criteria, including audiences and events. So when you do that, your app will pull down the latest values of those configuration parameters, and based on that can refresh and update the user experience. Cloud functions are for you to be able to do serverless computing, trigger, anything that you want to do in response to a conversion event. Invites would allow you to do the referral part where you can send invites to your friends about get them to install the app. Dynamic links, crash reporting. Okay, we have like about 5 minutes, so let's just go into the dashboard itself so we can look at that. So can you guys see this one okay? Can everyone see this? All right. So the first thing you're going to see is that this is actually for this Flooded app. So Flooded is this demo app that they provide you with Firebase Analytics that you can kind of go into and look at. It's a puzzle game that's available on Android and iOS. And it really has two modes. There's a quick play mode and a progressive mode. And the kinds of behaviors in both are different. So you can kind of go in and understand how the dashboard, what kind of insights are provided based on just the basic data that's being gathered through these events and user properties. So let's go into the Analytics tab. Come on. All right. So the first thing you're going to see is that when it starts gathering data, it automatically gives you a bunch of metrics. Active users, that's one of the most important measures. How many people are actively using your app? You'll see it gives you like daily, weekly, and monthly levels. Second, because it's important, average revenue. So there are two kinds of parameters that it tracks on your app: the average revenue per user and the average revenue per paid user. The way I think about this is actually, as your user base grows, the per paid user could be things that, they're fewer, they happen once, they're deterministic, like they paid for the app, they paid for a subscription. They're very deterministic, but they don't happen all the time. So in order to grow that pie, you really need more users. Whereas the average revenue per user is things that are like in-app purchases, right? To grow that pie, you actually need them to do more of the events. Then on this side, you can actually see attribution. So can you actually see this on mine? It looks kind of dull. So the first open attribution tells you when the users first install the app, and you can see which of your campaigns were most useful in actually getting them to do that. This particular tab, retention cohorts, allows you to understand how many of your users stay. So what this is doing, you can see that from right to left, it looks at per week how many of the users who started together stayed. So just looking at this, you can see that a lot of people start, and I wasn't too far wrong. By week 5, like a month later, only 11% of the people who started stay. So your attrition rate is like 90% for most apps. But the interesting thing is if you go down the stack, you can actually look at it and say, wait, 2 sets of people, 2 cohorts started together. What made this cohort? Can you see that this cohort, there are darker tabs? It means that more people stayed in the second week for those who started here than here. Why is that? This is a great way for you to look at it in terms of, hey, I might have released a new feature. I just updated a crash, right, a bug, right? Did it have an impact? This might be a good way for you to look at. User engagement just tracks all the things that the users are doing. In-app purchases tracks like the revenue from specifically those in-app purchase events. But let's kind of scroll up and look at a couple of things. The thing I was talking about, which is their IQ part, right? Like where they give you some amount of information about the demographics and the age and the user interest for the audience. So you can see here that in this case, apparently women do play more games than men. You might want to consider that when you build your app next time. It also tells you a lot of folks are in the United States. And if you look through some of this, the app version tab here tells you of your application. If you're releasing multiple versions of your app over time, which versions of that app are actually the most popular, the top 3 most popular versions, tells you what devices people are using to look at your app, and so on. At any given point in time, you can now see a subset of this. And you can kind of slice and dice this information in 2 ways. First is you can actually slice and dice it in terms of the time period. So right now it's showing you all the information gathered over 30 days. You can say what's happening in this app today, probably nothing much because no one's really kind of doing it yet. Or you can kind of look at what's the behavior quarter to date. So you can slice it over a time period. The more interesting thing is when you actually start adding filters. And this is where the things we were talking about, like user properties and events, come into play. So with user properties, I can now say, okay, show me all the people who are support users. So these are all been properties that have been set up, let's say, who are crashing users. This is a good one, I guess. So when you look at this, it actually slices it down to only show you the same metrics for that subset. And at this point, you might do something like go up here and say, is there a particular device model that's kind of doing more for these crashes than others? Second, events. So the dashboard lets you see this from the aggregate of all the events that are happening in your system. But what if you want to understand like the impact of a specific event, right? So you could go into this and actually look at a specific event type. And then again, you have the same drill down options. You can kind of like look at it and say, okay, I would like to be able to take this. So one thing I did forget to mention that if you set a filter, it kind of stays with you through all the different dashboard tabs. So you can then go ahead and filter it by something else. I don't know if they had any audiences set, probably not. Okay, so that would be about events. And let's see if there's anything interesting that we can look at in the events side. Let's see if there's a level event. Okay, we can look at the level up thing that we had seen in, okay, so here it is. So since this was a game, when you do look at something like level up, you can see that it automatically knows about this kind of custom parameters that are there, the suggested events, and you get additional dashboards that you can then analyze. So let's just talk about two other things before, I think I'm almost run out of time, but we'll talk about two other things that are important. One is, till now we have like individual users and individual events. But what if you want to actually combine user properties? Instead of just saying, show me everyone who's like in this age bracket, you want to say, show me everyone who's in this age bracket and is female and is in level 4. How do you do that? So the way you do that is by creating these audiences. An audience is like, you know, basically, let's kind of look at any one of these. So for crashing users, so an audience in this case says anyone who had this particular event happen in their app, and it immediately gives you a group of people that you can target. This is retroactive, meaning that the minute you create an audience, all the people who fit into that are automatically added in, and any new ones will keep added in as they go on. You can then use this to target them for notifications, for remote config, etc. The other last concept that I kind of want to just show you briefly is funnels. So if audiences let you segment the user based on these collection and combination of properties, funnels lets you see a sequence of events to understand where your user, basically, where you lost your user. So remember when we talked about desire paths, where you built this and he went there? Think of funnels as a way for you to detect that this is happening. So let's kind of look at what a funnel might look at. Oh, can't even see this. All right, can you guys see? I don't know if you can read it, but this one says select a minimum of 2 events, and then the first open, level start, level complete. So what they're saying is, I want to see all the users who have gone through this entire funnel where they started a game and they completed that level, right? So once I've defined this funnel, I can actually go in, oh, what did I do? I don't know which one I looked at. Was it progressive gameplay? Yep, it was progressive gameplay, sorry. So we'll look at gameplay progression. And now you can actually drill down and see, and this is the important part, you can see how many people stuck through the funnel. So there are so many people who were in level start, 2,800 of them, and then you lost about 400 of them in the level complete, right? So you can kind of then say, what about it? What happened in the segment that made those people drop off? So I'm actually going to go back to the slides and kind of just finish up, but if you guys have questions or want to come play with the demo in a bit, you can come after this. If you kind of think this is interesting and you want to like follow up further and kind of look at some more resources in the space, here are the 3 that I recommend. First, there's a ton of CODELABs, including one specifically on Firebase Analytics that's well worth setting up and trying out. Second, Firecast, they're like bite-sized videos that you can subscribe to and kind of follow on how you would do separate like services like notifications, remote config, etc. And third, this is literally something that happened last week, right when I was talking about this at DroidCon Boston, is that Udacity just released a course with Google that walks through Firebase Analytics and actually goes the extra mile of telling you how to do things like dynamic links and remote config. So here's the CodeLab. It's basically a very simple kind of like a retail app. Here is the flooded insights demo that you can look at if you actually want to go play with the dashboard. And I think that's pretty much it. Do I have time for questions? Yeah? Oh, okay. All right. So I'm going to be hanging out if you want to come ask me anything, but I'll just say two things. One is, if you're doing anything in the space, I'd love to talk to you, connect with me. If you're interested in actually learning about it, and you're in New York or Hudson Valley, we're actually running these kind of study camps where a bunch of us are working together over a couple of weeks to work through all of the Firebase CodeLab. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. And if you have questions, come find me.